In May 1915, film director D.W. Griffith released a picture that would forever change cinema and America forever. In the 2 decades prior, filmmakers had worked to create short entertainments, one-reel affairs produced to amuse working-class people, but Griffith had in mind something much more powerful. Whereas a single-reel show lasted 15 minutes, he dared to develop a film that lasted for 192 minutes. While Charlie Chaplin found himself in competition with soapbox cars, Griffith chose to restage the most deadly fight in American history, the Civil War. Using the first tools of film wizardry, the early vocabulary of the editor's bench, he formulated the basic grammar that has gone on to define blockbuster films across the world to this day. Never again would cinema be just an amusement, for Griffith proved that film was an art unlike none other seen before with his Birth of a Nation. But Griffith also released something into the land that was far from amusing. The son of a Confederate soldier, Griffith's film portrayed the end of slavery as a disaster for American society, showing Reconstruction as a time of social experimentation courting anarchy. Freed slaves were shown to behave as barbarians. Multi-ethnic men, so-called mulattoes, were lustful rapists, threatening to desecrate Southern white feminine virtue. And for the grand finale, the day was saved from ruin by the Ku Klux Klan.
When you made The Birth of a Nation, did you tell your father's story?
Well, after you mention it, perhaps I did.
How long did it take you?
Oh, I suppose it began when I was a child. I used to get under the table and listen to my father and his friends talk about the battles they'd been through and their struggles. And you know, you've heard your father tell about fighting day after day, night after night, and having nothing to eat but parched corn, and about your mother staying up night after night sewing robes for the Klan. The Klan at that time was needed and served a purpose.
It had the fury of life in it. I mean, it made your blood, it made your blood tingle.
It was about a tremendous struggle. It's about a story of people that were fighting desperately against great odds, great sacrifices, suffering, death. It was a great struggle, a great story. Story where young girls used to wear cotton or ermine and where the boys imagined.
While the NAACP adamantly protested the film, white audiences flocked to it in droves. When screened for Woodrow Wilson at the White House, the president is claimed to have said,
"It is like writing history with lightning, and my only regret is that it is all so terribly true."
Within the year, the Klan, which up to that point had become a nearly defunct Confederate veterans gathering, saw its membership explode, and not just below the Mason-Dixon line. Klan groups formed as far north as New England and in states like Michigan and beyond. Civil rights for African Americans were set backwards for decades, and thousands of lives were lost because of Birth of a Nation. On the centennial of its release, I wanted to revisit the film and understand what legacy it has. Griffith arguably created the grammar of blockbuster films, but if a language is created with a basis in racism, does that forever taint the language? Is American cinema inherently and forever beholden to the racism and bigotry that helped define its grammar? If we are going to discuss the language of film, it is important to begin with a little background. As early as the 1920s, film scholars began to theorize about how editing behaves like a language. But it was not until 1964 when film critic Christian Metz put forward his theory of the grand syntagmatique in his book Film Language, A Semiotics of Cinema, that the idea became a truly independent branch of film theory. Metz broke film down into a group of different segments, which he called syntagmas. Each shot had its own distinct nature and created a different impression in the mind of the viewer. Years later, film scholar Michel Colline would use Metz's ideas and rewrite them based on the ideas put forward by MIT linguistics professor Noam Chomsky, who was kind enough to sit for a brief interview with me. Colline began by recreating the grand syntagmatique based on the logic of Chomsky's theory of the transformational generative grammar. This theory explains how a person can understand an infinite number of sentences and judge which are grammatical and which are nonsense.
Generative grammar is just the theory of the language, which captures the basic property of language, namely what I said, each language yields an infinite array of hierarchically structured expressions which have interpretations at two interfaces with other systems. One, the system of thought, the other, sensory motor system. That's the basic principle of language, a system of discrete infinity with specific interpretations determined for each part of the structure that's generated. Early grammatical work, back in the 1950s, was concerned with a ubiquitous property of language, namely the one that's illustrated in which girls did you expect to see each other. Things are heard in places where they are interpreted, but they're also interpreted somewhere else, where the gap is. And the means for characterizing that were called transformations, move things from one place to another. Over the years, these systems have been refined, perfected, simplified, and by now it's possible to show that it was always thought that this displacement, which is ubiquitous in language, is a kind of an imperfection. It's some strange departure from simplicity. But we now know that it's actually the simplest system. If you simply take the simplest combinatorial operation possible, the one that's embedded somewhere in every computational system, namely take two elements that are already constructed and make up a new element from them without changing either of them or without ordering them. That's the operation called merge. That just yields displacement as a special case, and it yields it with the copy theory. So in a sense now we don't have transformational grammar, we just have the simplest possible combinatorial system, which incorporates the properties of language for which transformations were designed. Well, that's a very significant simplification and a deepening of the understanding of the nature of universal grammar. It doesn't have the complexity that was assumed in early work, so it appears, but it might reduce to very simple operations. Incidentally, this is a controversial thesis. It's not that everybody agrees. It's a minority view, but my view.
Next, I asked Professor Chomsky about his trace theory. Trace theory explains how a person understands that multiple sentences can refer back to a subject that is only named once, perhaps at the beginning of a paragraph. In the climax of Birth of a Nation, Griffith shows shots from inside and outside a cabin. How does the viewer know this is meant to represent one building? Trace theory explains this.
Well, suppose you take the sentence, we'll take a moderately interesting case. Take the sentence, the men expect to see each other. Each other is what's called an anaphor. It refers back to something else. It refers to the men. And typically, anaphors refer back to the closest phrase that they can connect with. Take which girls did the men expect to meet each other? In that case, each other doesn't go back to the men, to the closest one. It goes back to a remote one. Which girls? It's which girls each other. Well, the rule is, the general principle, that an anaphor has to go back to the closest one. And intuitively, we know the reason. Intuitively, which girls is actually in the medial position. It's the men expect which girls to see each other, but you put which girls in the front. Well, the way, at one point in the development of generative grammar, it was suggested that the way that happens is that when which girls moves from the position where it gets its semantic interpretation, moves to the front, it leaves a trace behind, and the anaphor refers to the trace. More modern theories eliminate the trace and just say that there are two copies. So the simplest generative process would in fact generate which girls the men expect which girls to meet each other with two copies of which girls. That's what the simplest system produces. And presumably that's what's in the mind. It's not what comes out the mouth. The reason it doesn't come out the mouth is it requires a lot of computation. You save a lot of computational effort if you just don't repeat the copies. Of course, that causes problems for perception, because in fact one of the hardest problems of what's called parsing, trying to figure out structure and meaning of a sentence from just the sequence of words, is one of the hardest problems are what are called filler gap problems. You have a filler, which girls is called a filler, there's a gap. You have to find out where the gap is. That's a hard problem. The problem would be simplified if you just repeated the copy. But language doesn't work like that. The language prefers to have computational efficiency and doesn't care about communicative efficiency. That's a general fact about language. One of the many reasons for thinking that language really isn't a communication system, contrary to dogma. It's a system of thought, as was traditionally held. But that's what the trace was, improved by the copy theory, which turns out, I can't go through it, but turns out to be the simplest possible system. So the simplest possible system seems to be what's in your mind, but what comes out your mouth is a more complicated system, and simply in order to reduce computational effort. So it appears there's many such cases.
Another idea I asked Dr. Chomsky about is his notion of discrete infinity. Human beings have the ability to generate an infinite number of sentences based off a finite number of grammatical rules and words. Dr. Chomsky elaborates.
I'll take the system of natural numbers. 1, 2, 3, 4. It's one property of it is it goes on forever. So there's no biggest number. There's always a bigger one. So it's infinite. The other major property is that there's no, if you pick two numbers right next to each other, say 6 and 7, there's no number in between them, that's what's called discreteness. So there's gaps between every two numbers. That's not true of what are called the real numbers, say the points on a line. If you take 2 points on a line, no matter how close they are, there's other points in between them. And actually it's denser. It's actually a dense set in a technical sense. But the natural numbers are a system of discrete infinity. The so-called real numbers, the points on a line, are not. That's just a continuous system. This arises, interestingly, in the case of natural language. Natural language is a system of discrete infinity. So there's a 6-word sentence, a 7-word sentence. There's no 6.5-word sentence, and the sentence, you can make bigger and bigger sentences without limit. So it's infinite and it's discrete. It's like the natural numbers. That's quite unusual in the biological world. In the biological world, there's finite systems and there are continuous systems, but it's pretty hard to find a system of discrete infinity. So if you take, say, animal communication, a monkey can have, say, half a dozen calls. That's finite. A bee, the famous waggle dance of the bees, indicates distance, height, quality, but it does it over a continuous range to the extent that any physical system can be continuous. So it could be any distance. So we have, and that's general, we have continuous systems, we have finite systems, but no systems of discrete infinity. That's one of the many reasons for supposing that language is basically unrelated to animal communication. But, and it is a pretty unusual biological phenomenon. The concept of how to, if you want to capture discrete infinity, you have to do it with a finite system. So the brain is finite, but it yields discrete infinity. My laptop is finite, but you can put in a program here which will, say, add numbers without limit. Of course, in order to build that, to have that, you have to be able to add external memory. So you stick in a, whatever they call it, you can do that indefinitely. This device here is what's called a Turing machine. It's a finite system which has infinite capacity as memory increases and time increases, and what it produces is discrete infinity. That's what computational systems are. Well, the brain seems to be a system like that for language. Maybe not for other things, but at least for language. And that's an unusual biological property. The general principle was well understood by the middle of the 20th century by work of Turing's Girl, other great mathematicians. It's the basis for the theory of computation. And it made it possible to apply these ideas in the study of language, and therefore to capture for the first time ever the basic property of every natural language, namely that every language consists of an infinite set of discrete elements which have hierarchical structure and yield interpretations in the system of thought. We use it for thinking and in articulation. That concept was sort of hinted at in the tradition, but never really captured, though it became possible to do that by the mid-20th century. That's the basis for what's called generative grammar.
In the 1920s, Soviet filmmaker Lev Kuleshov created an experiment that illustrates this idea. He photographed an actor with a blank face. Then he cut to an image suggesting what the man was looking at. Audiences believed the man was showing a great hunger when looking at the soup, great sadness when looking at the child in the coffin, and great passion when looking at the lounging woman. They did not realize that the man's face was the same blank expression shown over and over. This suggests that film has within it the same type of discrete infinity as language, that finite means, when put together in different combinations, leads to an infinite number of variations. As a final question, I wanted to ask Professor Chomsky about race and racism. At 88 years old, he has lived through some of the most tumultuous years in the history of racism. And while he has been an adamant critic of different policies of the Obama administration, he also recognizes that some of the criticism has been problematic.
But it's very hard to interpret the passionate hatred of Obama in many sectors except on racist grounds. I mean, for example, take this crazy birther movement. I mean, it's total insanity, but it's believed by a large sector of the population, even by very prominent people like Donald Trump. There was a poll a couple of years ago of Republicans' attitudes towards Obama, and it found that about 25% of Republicans think he might be Antichrist. That's beyond lunacy, but it's hard to interpret that in any terms except just pure racism. Take the concept of Obamacare. It's now a term that's used by everyone, even supporters. But it's basically a racist term. Why is it Obamacare? You don't call Medicare Johnson Care, let's say. But now everyone uses it. And it's a way to demonize a program that, in fact, most of the population approves of. But you have to demonize it. And once you demonize it by associating it with the snicker, then a lot of people oppose it. So you get majority opposition to what people are in favor of. These are, if you like, it's not unlike Birth of a Nation. These are racist tropes, techniques that are insinuated all over the place. And after all, this is a deeply racist country. I mean, we simply have not come to terms with the hideous history of treatment of African Americans. It's now 400 years since the first slaves came to Massachusetts, in fact. You look at that 400 years, there's literally a few decades in which African Americans had a sort of a moderately decent shot at entering the general society. There's the decade of Reconstruction, 1 decade, right after the Civil War, then ended by the North-South Compact. There were the big growth years, the 1950s and 60s, which did incorporate African Americans, gave them opportunities they hadn't had before, limited, but much more than before. That's about it. It's an astonishing record, and it includes a record of absolutely hideous slave labor. I mean, slavery was slave labor camps with torture and murder, every possible kind of atrocity. It's recent scholarship has shown that productivity in the slave labor camps actually increased faster than in manufacturing, and without any new technology, just by more and more brutal torture. That's a shocking fact, and that goes on and that's the basis for a lot of the wealth of the society, not just plantation owners, but the merchants of New England, the banking system of New England, the main industrial system, the biggest industrial installations, and Lowell, that were textile mills. That's you look at that. That's the basis for a good part of American wealth. Hideous, brutal slave labor, and after Reconstruction, 1877, it was essentially rebuilt by criminalizing black life. That's something which is happening again since Reagan under the drug war, which is basically a racist policy. This is a shocking record, a hideous record, and it's not recognized. I mean, there's some people who know something about it, but the true nature of it is still concealed, and that has plenty of immediate consequences, and I think it probably shows up in the crazy attitude towards Obama. Actually, I suspect, again, it's hard to prove, but I suspect that this is part of what lies behind the crazy gun culture in the United States. And how crazy it is kind of hard to believe. So, for example, a couple of weeks ago, the state of Iowa, I think it was Iowa, legislated that gun permits can be given to blind people. I mean, it's beyond insanity. I happened to be in Arizona recently, a couple of weeks ago, and I went to visit a friend whose former colleague who went, after retirement, he went to Arizona. He lives in an assisted living home. When you come to the building, there's a sign on the front that says gun-free area. Everywhere else, of course, people carry guns. There isn't any country like this anywhere. And it shows up in the very high rate of gun-inflicted homicides, which is out of sight. What's all that about? Well, a lot of it goes right back to early American history. There were two major crimes on which this country was built. The first was elimination of the indigenous population. They had a way of they sometimes protested that. That's why you read in the Declaration of Independence, everyone piously reads every year about the merciless Indian savages whose known way of warfare was destruction and murder. Why were the Indian savages merciless? They were defending themselves from invaders, but therefore they're guilty. That carries over to the present. One of the charges against Iran that's constantly made, just again in the New York Times a couple of days ago, is that they're supporting militias in Iraq which are killing American soldiers. In other words, we invade a country, destroy it, kill hundreds of thousands of people, incite sectarian conflicts that are tearing the region apart. If they try to defend themselves, that's a crime, like the merciless Indian savages. And no one bats an eyelash about that. Well, if you have to defend yourself against all these people, who you're attacking, you need guns. That's part of it. The other part is that right through American history, there was always great fear of a slave revolt. Maybe Thomas Jefferson, maybe the most enlightened person of the founders, warned. He realized he was a slave owner, like most of them, but he realized that it's a moral horror. However, he said that freeing the slaves wouldn't be easy, because each of them has 10,000 grievances, and they might revenge them, take revenge, and then exterminate the white race, and so on. That's Thomas Jefferson. But when you get down to a farmer in the rural South, it takes a different form. But it means you have to have guns, and that carries over, I think, right to the present. These are deep properties of American culture. And the worst of it is they're not recognized. And you have manifestations of them which are recognized to be grotesque, but the history is profound. Take a look at the countries of the world and see which ones are most supportive of Israeli policies. Well, of course, the U.S. Secondarily, Australia and Canada. Those are the most supportive. What kind of societies are these? These are settler colonial societies, a special form of imperialism, the worst form. It's not just imperial domination, but you eliminate the native population. These are also religious societies. In the United States, deeply fundamentalist. More than half of the Christians in the United States think that God promised Palestine, what's called the land of Israel, to the Jews. And that's a deep belief. You put these together, and you get kind of a cultural background for supporting Israel. First of all, they're doing God's will, carrying out God's will, so of course we favor it. And secondly, they're just like us. I mean, if we eliminated the indigenous population, it must be right and just, because we did it, and they're doing it, so it must be right and just. There's more than that, but I think these two factors are probably not insignificant.